Thank you for joining and welcome to another consultation and discussion for the Sexual Exploitation, Abuse and Harassment, or SEAH study related to the Safeguards Policy Statement by the Asian Development Bank. This consultation forms part of the stakeholder engagement that supports the Safeguard Policy Review and Update process, or the SPRU, as you may hear us refer to it as. My name is Azim Manji. I'm your consultation moderator for this session. This is our 15th thematic consultation topic so far, and this is the second in a series of regional consultations and discussions on sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. In today's consultation, we are joined by Bruce Dunn, a director within the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the ADB, and also by Samantha Hung, Chief of the Gender Equality Thematic Group in the ADB, as well as by Malika Shagozatova, a Social Development Specialist on Gender and Development, also within the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the ADB. Our Q&A moderator for this session is Dr. Zainab Al-Bakri, a Senior Consultant, Gender and Safeguards within the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department of the ADB. Other experts will also be on hand for the Q&A session from the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the ADB, and I know they all look forward to engaging with you for the discussion as well as responding to questions and feedback. This is our second interactive consultation on the issue of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, and the Safeguard session, and it builds on the previous sessions on gender that we had last week. Today, we have about 93 pre-registered participants from a number of countries throughout East and Southeast Asia, as well as the Pacific. Most of our participants here today are a mix from government, implementing agencies, and executing agencies, as well as civil society. Nearly 80% of you are from outside the ADB network, which is wonderful to see, of course, and I hope this means we have diverse and animated discussions on the issues to be presented today. The most significant representations today are from Indonesia, Lao PDR, Mongolia, Philippines, PNG, as well as Australia. A note that we will be extensive with our use of SEAH as an acronym in English for sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, and GBV as an acronym in English for gender-based violence. We ask both participants as well as simultaneous translators to make use of these acronyms. In this consultation, Samantha Hung and Malika Shagozatova will jointly present the main summary issues related to the study they have prepared on sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, and the relationship of this to the gender study presented last week, as they both pertain to the Safeguards Policy Update. From the presentations, we are hoping that participants like you will share insights on the potential gaps of the provisions and implementation of the 2009 policy, and propose recommendations to ensure the strengthening of the forthcoming policy. Comments received from this consultation will inform the revision of ADB's Safeguards policy. Before I call upon our speakers, here's a few gentle meeting reminders. As all stakeholders and participants have consented when joining, the ADB is recording this session for the purposes of preparing a summary of the meeting. It is the intention that these recordings will be available to ADB staff and consultants, and then more broadly to all members of this consultation publicly. If you have any concerns about this, please contact the Secretariat at the email address posted in the chat box. A reminder to please join from a quiet, distraction-free area, and please turn off your microphone when you're not speaking. During the Q&A session, when invited to do so, you may ask questions by typing them into the chat box or raising your hand virtually. You will then be asked by Zainab to unmute yourself and turn on your camera so that you can ask your question live. As we are all colleagues here, please be respectful to each other and the views that they represent. Zainab El-Bakri and I will manage time to ensure that we keep within our schedule. IT support will continue to be provided throughout this dialogue and consultation. You may ask for IT support by typing your issue or query into the chat box in any of the languages we are using today, and someone will help you immediately. As we're all joining by Zoom, here's a few guidance notes when using the important Zoom buttons. Aside from English, we have simultaneous interpretation available in Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, and Vietnamese for this session. To access the simultaneous interpretations feature, click on the globe icon found on the lower part of your screen and select your preferred language. Don't forget to press the mute original audio button so that you can hear the voice of your simultaneous interpreter clearly and suppress the English original speaker. For those of you listening in Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, and Vietnamese, if you feel any of us speaking in English are speaking too fast and you would prefer us to slow down, you can ask us to slow down by going to the bottom of your Zoom screen and clicking on the reactions button. When you've clicked on the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can then press the slow down button, which is two reverse arrows pointing to your left in white. This will let us English speakers know to slow down. We ask that you use your proper name in Zoom for our documentation. To change your name on Zoom, click on the Participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. On the right-hand side of your screen, look for your own name, then click on the More button on the right-hand side of your name. Then click on the Rename button. You can change your name by typing your name in, adding the agency you represent, and then clicking OK. If you wish to send a message, question, or share feedback, click on the Chat button. If you wish to comment or raise a question live in the language you prefer, click on the smile icon or the reactions button, and then click on the raise hand emoji. To speak and unmute yourself, click on the microphone icon. To show your video, click on the video icon. These next set of slides show how we at the ADB value diverse and informed feedback from our wide range of stakeholders. So let me refer you to the slides on ADB's commitment to meaningful consultations. I'd invite you to read the slides while I remind you that these sessions will be recorded and documented and subsequently distributed during and for each event. This allows the ADB to review, consider, and respond to, if necessary, any comments and inputs made. If you wish to opt out of the recording or distribution of the recordings, please contact the Secretariat through the email address at the bottom of the screen. If you have any issues or concerns on the recording, confidentiality, potential risks, abuse, or any other kind of discrimination during the course of these consultations, please get in touch with us through the email address that's on the slide or that appears in the chat box. For this consultation, we have about 2 hours, and here's what we have planned to maximize both your time as well as ours. Firstly, Mr. Bruce Dunn will provide his welcome remarks and provide a contextual overview for this sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment and safeguard study. Mr. Dunn is a director of the Safeguards Division in ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Second, Samantha Hung will provide an overview of how specifically the SEAH issues relate to the gender work and the policy imperatives being implemented by the ADB. This will frame the discussion on SEAH specifically and allow us to engage on issues of how SEAH can be considered in the Safeguards Policy Update. Samantha is Chief of the Gender Equality Thematic Group in the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the ADB. Third, we will follow on from Samantha's presentation with a presentation by Malika Shagozatova, a social development specialist on gender and development in the ADB. Malika will detail some of the SEAH study findings and key issues, including a comparator analysis and some of the performance standards and requirements, and how these specifically relate to the revision of the current safeguards policy and might be considered in the revised policy. After the presentations by Bruce, Samantha, and Malika, we will take a brief 5-minute break where I will ask you to think about some feedback on the presentations and these consultations in general, and how you might offer us some advice on how to improve or better our engagement with you. Finally, when we return from the break, and as a culmination of the previous presentations, we will have an open discussion on the SEAH and GBV issues raised in the presentations, as well as by the study summary paper, which has been emailed to all pre-registered participants and continues to be available for download from the various ADB websites, including the Safeguard Policy Update website. This Q&A session will be facilitated and moderated by Dr. Zainab El-Bakri, a senior consultant on gender and safeguards in ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. A reminder that throughout this consultation, you may ask your questions in English, Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, and Vietnamese by typing them into the chat box or through raising your hand virtually using the Zoom functions. Zainab will prompt us with guide questions to frame the conversations for the discussions we will have, and these guide questions will remain up during the duration of the break, as well as during the introduction of Zainab's session. Please then join us for a quick event evaluation before we turn you back to Bruce Dunn of the ADB to give us a wrap-up and indicative next steps of the consultation. It's now my pleasure to turn it over to Director Mr. Bruce Dunn for his welcome remarks and contextual overview of the SEAH study. Bruce, if you please.
Thank you very much, Azim. And good day, welcome. And thank you to all of you for joining this regional consultation on sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, or SEAH for short in English. This session builds on the consultations that we held last week, more broadly looking at gender and safeguards. For this session, I see we have a mixed group. We actually have representation from governments, ADB developing member countries, civil society organizations, and also a range of other non-governmental stakeholders, mostly from East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. But wherever you're from, we're very pleased to welcome you to this session, and we'd very much like to encourage you to actively participate, sharing your views and recommendations during the Q&A session a little bit later on. Now, I actually see that for today's session, we do have a number of people that are joining these consultation sessions for the first time. Some of you are coming back, and we always appreciate that dialogue continuing from previous sessions. But for those of you that are joining for the first time, let me just provide a little bit of brief background on the update to ADB's Safeguard Policy Statement and to this consultation process. Now, firstly, ADB's 2009 Safeguard Policy Statement, or SPS for short, went through an internal evaluation that was undertaken by ADB's independent evaluation department, and they concluded a study in May 2020. Amongst other things, the study recommended that ADB should update and modernize the policy. It had been more than 10 years since the policy was approved, and so of course many things had changed during that period. We have lessons learned from implementation experience, but also the policies of a number of other multilateral financial institutions have of course been updated during that time period. And the evaluation identified a number of policy issues and gaps that was recommended that ADB should consider and address as part of a comprehensive update process. Now, to inform the policy update, ADB then launched a series of analytical studies on different safeguard topics for discussion through these regional consultation programs. As Azim has mentioned, we've so far undertaken consultations on 14 different topics. We've been doing these sessions actually from November last year, and we've been listening to the voices of a range of stakeholders. And these studies provide a sort of an analysis or benchmarking of ADB's current policy. We're comparing the current policy against that of other multilateral financial institutions, in addition to internal work on looking at implementation experiences. Now, we share these reports in advance of the consultations, and then during the consultations themselves, we look forward to having your feedback. And this provides us with a perspective on implementation, as well as your views in terms of the direction that you think the policy should be taking. Of course, many of you from developing member countries have got experience with implementation, and that's very important for us to hear. You may also have views in terms of where you think the policy should go. You may be recommending certain directions for the policy, but you also might have concerns about things that we are proposing, for example, around some of the challenges that you might face during implementation. But whatever those views are, we're very much here to listen. That's very much the purpose of this consultation program. So I'd really like to encourage you during these sessions to share your voice, and we will take that into consideration as we move to develop the policy further. Now, coming to today's consultation topic, as mentioned, we're going to be focusing on a very important and very challenging issue of addressing risks associated with sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. And this was, in fact, one of the issues that was identified as a gap in ADB's existing policy. Globally, there has been increasing attention to these issues. And of course, for any individual or community that has been subject to these issues, it can have widespread and long-lasting impacts. So it's important that we look at this issue carefully and to see how we may be able to address these risks in the context of projects that we might support. Now, during this session, we will have a presentation. My colleague, Ms. Samantha Hung, she is the chief of ADB's Gender Equality Thematic Group. She will be providing you with some further background, looking at the commitments that ADB has made to addressing sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment through our own organization at ADB, as well as within the projects that we finance. Following that, we will have a second presentation by my colleague, Malika Shagatsova. She will be presenting further details on the benchmarking study and what we have found through that. After that, as you've heard from Azim, we will then go into a moderated presentation by Zainab El-Bakri. She's a senior gender consultant. So we're very much looking forward to hearing your views today. And with that, let me hand over to Samantha Hung for the first presentation. Thank you again for joining.
Thank you very much, Bruce, and good morning, everybody, or good afternoon if you're already in a different time zone. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today. And as Bruce said, I'm really looking forward to the discussion. We have quite a diverse group here on the call, and it will be really interesting and helpful for us to hear all your different opinions, including people from government as well as civil society and other organizations. So as Bruce mentioned, the Asian Development Bank places a high priority on gender equality as a whole. Accelerating gender equality is one of 7 operational priorities for the Asian Development Bank. And within that context, addressing gender-based violence broadly is a priority for us. Last week, we spoke about options and ways to potentially address gender broadly in terms of the safeguards policy update. But today, we're really zooming in on the particular issue of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, or SEAH. And going forward, I may just use the acronym SEAH to make it easier. So just to say also that in terms of our commitment to accelerating gender equality and our current operational plan, that does commit us to address project risks of SEAH. So it is really in this broader context that we have developed a background study, and we are focusing in today's discussion on how this issue can be addressed potentially within the safeguards policy update. So if I could please move to the next slide, and I will start with some background as to our corporate commitment and why we are pursuing more work in this area. So on the slide here, you can see the top point that back in April 2018, at a Heads of Multilateral Development Banks, or MDBs, meeting, the Asian Development Bank and 9 other multilateral development banks confirmed their commitment to prevent sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, or SEAH, within their own institutions, as well as across their operations. So this was reaffirmed a few months later in October 2018 at a global safeguarding summit in London, the first of its kind, and it was hosted by the UK government, the then Department for International Development, or DFID, which is now part of the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, or FCDO. So this shared commitment amongst multilateral development banks, which is actually at the highest leadership level. So it was really our president and other presidents who made this joint commitment on behalf of their organizations, was really to ensure the creation of an environment in which SEAH is not only rejected, but active steps are taken to address the challenges faced by organizations in this regard. And this undertaking was also to maintain and advance standards to prevent SEAH throughout acknowledgement of 7 common principles. So I'll tell you what these 7 common principles are one by one. So firstly, to foster a culture of respect and high standards of ethical behavior across our institutions. Secondly, to establish and maintain standards which are aimed at preventing SEAH and other forms of misconduct. Thirdly, to provide a safe and trusted environment for those who may be affected by SEAH to be able to step forward to report incidents and concerns. Fourthly, to provide protection for those affected, as well as whistleblowers or witnesses within institutions, and to take appropriate measures against any form of retaliation that may occur. Fifthly, to maintain robust policy frameworks and clear institutional mechanisms that address how incidents and allegations will be handled. Sixthly, to provide effective training programs so that all staff understand the requirements and standards of behavior. And lastly, to support our clients to develop and implement policies and mechanisms that address SEAH. So as part of this shared commitment, the Asian Development Bank, alongside the other multilateral development banks that share this commitment, we contribute to and participate in periodic joint reporting. And the latest joint report update was submitted late last year in September 2021, to be precise. So this joint multilateral development bank commitment and work in strengthening institutional and operational approaches to tackle SEAH has also led to a deepened engagement between multilateral development banks in terms of knowledge sharing and collaboration. In November 2020, a dedicated multilateral development bank working group on SEAH was formed to facilitate this collaboration and coordination between our institutions, which at that time and still to this date, had slightly different policies and procedures in place for addressing SEAH. This MDB SEAH working group focuses on development of a knowledge sharing platform and exploring opportunities for joint pilot initiatives, as well as country level collaboration around specific investments. And this collaboration is really intended to facilitate communication, share resources that the different organizations may develop, and as well as practical tools and training. And ultimately, this aim of the collaboration is so that at country level, we can enhance our collaboration to explore scope for piloting harmonized approaches and joint interventions. If I could please move to the next slide. And so this really led us to why we have done this benchmarking study. So as my colleague Bruce mentioned earlier, the 2009 Independent Evaluation Department report on the Safeguards Policy Statement noted that this was a gap and that emerging issues such as SEAH at the work site and in terms of broader impacts on communities was lacking in the current Safeguards Policy Statement. So the IED report further noted that safeguarding against SEAH cuts across environmental safeguards, health and safety, gender and social protection, and therefore may require a more integrated approach and analysis cutting across safeguards and gender team expertise to enhance synergies and reduce duplication. The report further stressed the importance of sufficient operational guidance through the operational manual, good practice notes, and training for ADB staff and clients. So in responding to this independent evaluation report, ADB's management recognized that there were some real gaps in emerging areas such as SEAH that need to be addressed, and that it was further noted that interim guidance on these areas can be developed prior to the update of the Safeguards Policy Statement. ADB further recognizes that channeling of SEAH concerns and incident response through existing grievance redress mechanisms, which are designed for current Safeguards Policy Statement requirements, may not be appropriate or sufficient for handling SEAH cases due to the sensitivity of the issues and confidentiality requirements involved. So it was really based on this independent evaluation department review and management acknowledgement of the gap that this benchmarking exercise was undertaken to look at SEAH in safeguards across different multilateral development banks to compare ADB's current policies and practices with those of our peers. If I could please move to the next slide where I'll just explain the approach to this study. So as mentioned, the main objective of this benchmarking study is to compare ADB's current policies, strategies, and practices of work on gender and SEAH specifically with that used by our peer multilateral development banks. So the study involved identifying gaps, strengths, and weaknesses, as well as good practices, lessons learned, and emerging issues in addressing SEAH from our peer organizations. And in doing so, it is helping us to identify operational implications for ADB. This study was undertaken as a desktop exercise, paper-based, and involved the review of key ADB, multilateral development bank, and third-party documentation, as well as resources from United Nations agencies, non-government organizations, various other reports, and academic studies. The desk review was supplemented by virtual interviews with ADB staff and some representative colleagues from peer multilateral development banks. And the study will, of course, be further supplemented through additional consultations with developing member countries and civil society organizations, including today's consultation. So with that, I would like to hand over to Malika from my team to present the study's key findings and key issues. Thank you, and over to you, Malika.
Thank you, Sam. And good morning to all participants of this consultation session. I will present the key findings of the benchmarking study. And as my colleagues, I also look forward to discussion today. We hope you can share your reaction to what we are presenting and proposed approaches, as well as share your views on challenges and opportunities to address SEAH if this is included in the revised safeguards policy as a compliance requirement. So for this study, we first looked at how SEAH is included in the current ADB policy principles and practices, and we started with the safeguard policy. So in the policy, safeguards are understood as seeking to avoid, minimize, and mitigate adverse environment and social impacts, including protecting the rights of those who are likely to be affected or marginalized by development process. In environmental safeguards requirement 1, ADB sets out our commitment to occupational and community health and safety. And while SPS notes that there are potential gender-related risks that we need to take into account, it does not specifically refer to gender-based violence or sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. We also have ADB Gender and Development Policy that describes ADB's vision to do good by investing in gender equality more widely and addressing female-focused violence specifically. The requirements in the initial poverty and social assessment, as well as relevant operation manuals, broadly address adverse social and gender risks and require ensuring that project design will maximize social benefit, avoid or minimize social risks, particularly for those who are vulnerable and marginalized, as well as specifically target risks for human trafficking. Other relevant ADB strategies, such as, for example, social protection strategy, also indirectly address many risk factors, for example, poverty, disability, unemployment, which makes some groups more vulnerable to risks of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. As Sam mentioned, our gender work is guided by ADB Corporate Strategy 2030 and its operational priority 2. And this operational priority recognizes and acknowledges that achieving gender equality is a necessary enabler for other strategic objectives that are described in the Strategy 2030. An operational priority, an operational plan for operational priority 2 specifically calls for assessing project risks of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, and human trafficking in the context of measures for eliminating gender-based violence. Also, as Sam mentioned, in management response to report that was prepared by Independent Evaluation Department, ADB recognized that there are gaps, there are real gaps in risk that related to broader context of gender-based violence and sexual violence, and this needs to be addressed. But we have to be mindful on very clear distinction between compliance requirements and aspirational goals. It also noted the value of developing interim guidance on this important area to guide this important area of work prior to the SPS update. Let me now move to the key study findings. Next slide, please. Okay, so for the benchmarking study, we looked at the policies, policy frameworks and requirements of Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the Inter-American Development Bank, International Finance Corporation, and the World Bank. We specifically looked at SEAH-related provisions in safeguards policy and standards. We also checked if there is a use of SEAH risk assessment during the project preparation, if these banks are using materials that would support implementation of provisions in the safeguards policies, and what are the specific requirements that are related to SEAH in the procurement documents. The key aspects that were covered in this study include the scope and application of respective multilateral development bank safeguard systems with respect to the risk of SEAH, including relevant operational requirements that will be applicable not just to the MDB, but also to the borrowers, executing and implementing agencies, contractors, and clients. Next slide, please. So when we looked at how SEAH included in the safeguards policies, one of the key findings of the study was that MDBs are using different approaches to tackle SEAH in their operations. Some MDBs have incorporated explicit strong provisions in their safeguard standards, both as standalone or across relevant standards, while others have developed tools, procedures, and recommendations through adoption of good practice note that can be used during the project design and implementation. And if we look at across MDBs that were included in the benchmarking study, Inter-American Development Bank has the most extensive SEAH-related provisions. It clearly requires that borrowers have to address gender-related risks, including gender-based exclusion, sexual and gender-based violence, and human trafficking. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development has an overall commitment to prevent and address any form of violence and harassment. And the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which just recently approved the revised Environment and Social Framework, or ESF, EARD included an elevated importance on gender equality and commitment to address broader risks for gender-based violence. The World Bank and International Finance Corporation safeguards policies do not specifically refer to neither to gender-based violence nor to SEAH, but they use other operational tools, which I will discuss in the next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we also looked at how SEAH included, if there are any specific provisions in performance standards and requirements. So again, in this area, the Inter-American Development Bank has the most comprehensive coverage, with explicit mention of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment related consideration across various standards, in addition to a standalone gender standard. And these requirements include risk assessment, requirements for contractors, sexual harassment policies and code of conduct, sensitization of workers and communities, and establishment of grievance redress mechanism and reporting. In European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD, SEAH included in performance requirement 2 on labor and working conditions, and performance requirement 4 on health, safety, and on health, safety, and security. The safeguard standards of Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the GBV and SEAH related requirements are included in one standard, ESS1, Environment and Social Standard, which requires environment and social assessment and management of risks. And these requirements includes specific measures to manage risks of project-related gender-based violence, but looks at both project affected persons and communities, and the project workers, worker-to-worker nexus. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, the World Bank does not specifically refer to the gender-based violence or sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, although it covers identification of gender impacts, and this is one of the requirements. At the same time, the World Bank has a well-developed operational tools for identifying sexual violence risks, and the bank issued a good practice note on addressing sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in projects with large infrastructure work. So this was first published in 2018, and it was further updated in 2020 based on the lessons learned and experience in implementation across projects that been in the process of design, but also those projects that were implementation. The World Bank requires use of project risk screening tools to determine the level of SEAH risks. And it also requires to include appropriate and proportional mitigation measures, taking into account both rating from the risk assessment tool, but also as a part of the environment and social assessment. This has to be further supported through inputs from community consultations. The World Bank also has further strengthened contractors' accountability through enhanced and strengthened procurement requirements. And it's continuously guiding borrowers on how to assess bidders' responsiveness and competence to comply with specific SEAH-related obligations during bid evaluation processes. Attention to sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment is incorporated into the World Bank project cycle. So it starts with the use of SEAH risk assessment. It requires stakeholder engagement. It also requires code of conduct, and SEAH-specific requirements are explicitly included in the procurement processes, as well as there are clear requirements on establishing a reporting and grievance mechanism specifically tailored for SEAH cases. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development also applies risk screening tools to determine the level of risks that are related to European EBRD is actually using gender-based violence and harassment, which is like broadly covering SEAH as well. And these are risks that are specific to, they have to look at the risks that are specific to projects. And it also requires including appropriate and proportionate mitigation measures. EBRD together with International Finance Corporation jointly developed and published practical guidance for private sector operations. It titled Addressing Gender-Based Violence and Harassment, Emerging Good Practices for Private Sector. This can be easily found online. It provides some very interesting and practical tools on how SEAH can be addressed in the private sector. Next slide, please. So this slide provides a high-level comparative summary of findings of this benchmarking study on what approaches used by different multilateral development banks, but also donors funds, and how they are addressing SEAH. It shows that although like each of these organizations may have slightly varied approaches on how they're doing it, addressing SEAH is increasingly on the agenda of all organizations. Next slide. Yeah, this slide provides high-level summary on key study findings. So the study found that overall, ADB is potentially at risk of falling behind of other peer MDBs in terms of existence of established approaches to address sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in our operations. At this point of time, we do not have system in place which is specifically designed to identify, mitigate, and respond to project-related risk of SEAH, including both worker-to-worker and worker-to-community impacts. Risks that related to sexual violence are also not explicitly identified in the current safeguard policy as a consideration in project screening and categorization. In addition, as Sam already mentioned, and this was findings of the Independent Evaluation Department's report, if there will be any incidents on the project level, this would currently be handled through existing complaints reporting and grievance redress mechanisms that are not specifically designed for this purpose. There is no due consideration to sensitivity, confidentiality, or use of survivor-centered approach, which are very important for good practice in handling of SEAH allegations and cases. Furthermore, we also found that there is an absence of common multilateral development bank kind of coordinated or harmonized approaches or good practice standards and requirements for addressing sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. And this may create challenges for co-financing and may also result in greater transaction costs for our borrowers. And having consistent approaches and requirements in procurement, reporting, and service provision would make it easier for ADB as an institution, but also to collaborate with other multilateral development banks on project level, at country level, and this would increase efficiency and coherence. Next slide, please. So what are the proposed directions? So to address the lack of guidance related to gender-based violence and sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in ADB financing, we are currently finalizing a good practice note on addressing sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in ADB finance project with civil works. This good practice note is developed with the intent to support ADB staff, our borrowers, staff of executive and implementing agencies, and contractors in designing and implementing measures to address risks of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in our projects. This good practice note is not an ADB policy, and this is a very important point. And the recommendation that it provides will be advisory in nature. It is also proposed that application of recommendations in this good practice note will be piloted in selected developing member countries. And it will be piloted starting from the new project with infrastructure development components and civil works. The good practice note is designed based on 7 guiding principles. So let me just highlight 3 of them in the interest of time. So first principle is that it's a principle of shared responsibility. It is clear that actions against SEAH will require close collaboration and commitment, not only from ADB staff, but also our consultants, contractors, borrowers, and executive and implementing agencies on the country level. Secondly is a survivor-centered approach. This is a core principle, and this requires that we always prioritize the needs and rights of survivors of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. And thirdly, the principle of proportionate action, meaning that measures to tackle sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment should be proportionate to project-related risks, existing country SEAH frameworks and how they are implemented, and the policies and practices in place in executive and implementing agencies. So the good practice note outlines responsibilities for incorporating, implementing, and monitoring and reporting SEAH-related measures. And it also provides guidance and set of tools, checklists, templates, and minimum good practice standards that can be used by counterpart staff and contractors to develop effective approaches and establish systems to tackle sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment during the project design and during the project implementation. So now I'm moving to the last slide. We identified 6 key issues for further consideration. The benchmarking exercise highlighted several gaps in ADB policies, the existing practices and resources when we compare it to those of peer multilateral development banks. The following issues are proposed for further considerations. And I will start with the SEAH in project risk classification system. Consideration, it is proposed that the consideration should be given to an integrated project risk classification system and integrated environmental and social impact assessment to avoid a siloed approach. It would be important that the contextual risks in project risk categorization, incorporated broadly, and it should take into account country and project specific factors. For SEAH specific, that we need to look at prevalence of the gender-based violence, violence against women, and sexual violence, existing country level legal frameworks and the implementation, and gender norms that might also normalize violence against women, gender-based violence, or sexual violence. Project-specific factors should include risks associated with a labor influx, project categorization on resettlement, indigenous people and environment, use of military or private security forces, and of course, operations in fragile and small island context. All these factors may interfere and amplify risks of gender-based and sexual violence in our project, and this is need to be considered and incorporated in the risk categorization. Use of risk-based approach would require development of corresponding risk assessment tools to inform a proportionate approaches to address SEAH in project design, including specific provisions for procurement, strengthening capacity of project implementation agencies, and to provide overall support during the implementation and ensuring that response measures are following good practice standards. The next area is including SEAH as a cross-cutting issue at minimum in standards for community and occupational health and safety and labor and working conditions. This would cover SEAH risks in worker-to-worker and worker-to-community nexus. The issue would require more detailed discussion of specific provisions and requirements for safeguarding against SEAH risks and what will be included in the updated standards. Further review will be needed on the possible coverage of SEAH in the new standards based on the comparative analysis, and also looking at the implementation experience and lessons learned from comparator multilateral development banks, as well as also more in-depth discussion with government executing and implementing agencies. The next area, the issue that we will be looking at is how we can incorporate more customized grievance redress mechanism in stakeholder engagement and disclosure policy standard, and how the proportionate measures will be included to respond to potential SEAH risk and impact of projects. It is important to know that this should be customized in culturally appropriate way for different types of affected people, including survivors of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. And it was also important to keep in mind that use of traditional dispute resolution methods for SEAH cases have to be strongly discouraged. While we were looking at the results of the benchmark study and how we will be moving forward, it was clear that there might be need for additional due diligence requirements due to deeper coverage, mandated through the performance standard approach, and technical and financial resources may be required to cover the expanded thematic safeguards and cross-cutting areas of gender-based violence and sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in labor and working conditions and community health and safety. And of course, this may result in increased due diligence requirements for borrowers. Although right now the extent of additional requirements may, we need to explore more to understand how this vary between countries. There may be also efficiencies which can be gained from the greater MDB harmonization and coordination at country level. And as ADB adopts a new model, there may be a risk of project processing time increasing, and if additional resources are not invested in the design, monitoring, and supervision of project safeguards. So to address all these issues, we think that a transition period of at least 1 year will be needed before the policy effectiveness. SEAH guidance and tools is another area that we paid attention to. And in line with the MDB experience in introducing SEAH safeguarding measures and to bring ADB on a par with our peer MDBs, it is recommended that in parallel to the ongoing work on review and update of the safeguards policy and development of standards, ADB pilots a good practice note on addressing SEAH and ADB finance projects with civil works. The pilot approach would allow us to try out operational approaches in addressing sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, as well as give us a time to build capacity, overall understanding, raise awareness of country stakeholders, borrowers, staff of executive and implementing agencies, and ADB itself during the pilot period. The good practice note can be then updated following the pilot and lessons learned, and according also to emerging good practices from other MDBs. It is also recommended to develop a toolkit to provide further guidance to our executing and implementing agencies in developing member countries and contractors on how they can establish grievance redress mechanisms and reporting systems and case handling systems that are specifically tailored for SEAH incidents. We have to recognize that we need to strengthen expertise on SEAH through addressing gaps in staffing and ensuring access to specialized training programs. It would be also important to address gaps in knowledge and skills on how to apply SEAH-specific requirements in our executive and implementing agencies that we are working with. And in this area, partnerships with peer multilateral development banks on safeguards training and maybe capacity building for the developing member country stakeholders can assist in building capacity at country level. And it would also have us leveraging harmonized system and existing materials and replicating past collaboration and establishing safeguard learning centers in selected DMCs. Last but not least, there might be increase in technical assistance needs for increased technical assistance resources to support expanded SEAH-related project safeguard due diligence and to ensure that we have resources to build capacity of our borrowers. And further assessment of these issues, including costs, this needs to be undertaken through the next stages of the safeguard policy update, review and update process. In the meantime, ADB will be providing additional technical resources to support the rollout of the proposed pilot. Thank you. I will be happy to hear your views. I will be happy to answer your questions. Look forward to this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Malika, and to all three of our presenters, thank you very much. Samantha Hung and Malika Shagozatova for your very comprehensive and detailed presentations and the overviews on the sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment and gender-based violence issues that you've raised for all of us to consider. These presentations offer us clarity and present some of the unique challenges and perhaps even some of the disparities which have been raised by ADB's IED publicly and the need for them to be considered in the revision of the safeguards policy by around March 2023. The comparative analyses on SEAH presented by Malika will need to be considered in how the ADB becomes potentially a leader in incorporating sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment, as well as gender-based violence issues in the revised safeguards policy. We hope we can get to feedback on these issues and an opportunity to delve deeper into some of the issues raised during the discussions arising from the Q&A session. Before we do that, let me also thank Director Bruce Dunn for framing and contextualizing this discussion. For the Q&A session, we have about 70 to 75 minutes, but there's some flexibility in that. And just to note that should you wish to raise a question or share an experience anonymously, please send the message in the chat box, but instead of selecting to everyone in the chat, please select sending the message to Jennifer DeBellin or Neil Aquino. Perhaps Neil Aquino, as I understand Jennifer is having some technical issues. Both of these individuals are members of our team working behind the scenes, and they will repost your question under their own names to protect your identity and offer you anonymity. Let's now pause for a 5-minute break. The next slide will show you, next slide again, please, some guide questions that we have. And you'll see at the top right-hand corner a countdown timer. As that timer approaches 0, you'll know that it's time to return to your screens and the presentation's about to start. We also will have some background music playing. So if you do step away from your screen, as that music begins to fade, you'll know that it's also time to return to your screen. A bit later on in this consultation, we will be presenting you with 3 feedback questionnaires. The first is an immediate questionnaire and a Zoom poll. The second 2 offers you an opportunity to provide input on how specifically the ADB can improve these consultations, can improve the way that we engage with stakeholders like yourselves, and improve the way in which feedback is gained and incorporated into the final study report. So please think about those questions, and we will ask you to respond a bit later on. But for now, we are going to have a bit of a 5-minute break, and then when we return, we will have the Q&A session as facilitated by Zainab Al-Bakri. So see you all in about 5 minutes. Welcome back, everybody. We will now have the Q&A discussion, which is why most of us are here, as facilitated by Dr. Zainab El-Bakri, a consultant to the ADB. You will see some guide questions flashed on the screen now, and these have been up since the break. Please feel free to also share your experiences on how the ADB can better target or improve SEAH and GBV issues in the revision of the 2009 Safeguards Policy Statement as aligned to ADB Strategy 2030 and the OP2, which Samantha and Malika both mentioned. A reminder that you can also ask questions through posting them in the chat box or through virtually raising your hand in the Zoom feature by clicking on the reactions button at the bottom of your screen in either English, Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, or Vietnamese. And a further reminder that if you wish to post your question anonymously, please select in the chat, sending a message to either Jennifer DeBellin or Neil Aquino, and they will repost your question under their own names, offering you anonymity and an opportunity to have your identity protected. And then, of course, please then join us for a quick event evaluation, as I mentioned, before we turn you back to Bruce Dunn to give us a wrap up and the next steps following this consultation. So with that, please allow me to turn it over to Zainab El-Bakri for the Q&A session. Zainab, if you please.
Thank you, Azim, and welcome to all the participants. We had, can we get the list of questions that we had earlier, please? Can we have the slide with the list of questions on it? Yes, thank you. So these are suggested questions to start off the discussion, but of course, all participants are free to ask, comment, elaborate on whatever they wish to as related to the issue of SEAH. We are especially interested in hearing from government participants who are from governments and from executing agencies, because they will be the ones to implement some of the provisions that will be put in place as regards SEAH. So it would be interesting to hear from you, especially as to what are the kinds of potential challenges that you see yourselves facing when ADB comes up with its new provisions related to SEAH. So again, the floor is open. Please indicate your interest to speak by raising your hand, or if you want to put a question straight in the chat. I think we have received already 1 or 2 questions, so we can start with those. Can we go back to those questions? I think they were in the... Okay, so there is one question that has been raised already, and I'll read it out. It essentially is, what can MDBs or ADB in particular do when there is no national law regarding SEAH? For example, what can be done in addressing GBV, especially in the context of a person's specific sexual orientation or gender identity? I don't know, Sam or Malika, do you want to answer that question first before we move on? Sam?
Hi, sorry, but I was just trying to unmute. Yes, sure, yeah, I can have a go, and then perhaps Malika may want to supplement. So the question, as I understand, is what do we do if there is no national law on SEAH? Was first part of the question. The second one was specifically in relation to SOGI, correct? So I think that part of our proposed approach has to really be contextualized. So it's a proposed risk-based approach, looking at the extent to which there is a risk of SEAH happening in a project context, And based on that, then the responses should be proportionate to prevent it. So part of looking at the risk and understanding the context has to also consider the national context. And there are different laws in different countries that we work in, and also laws about saying in specifically, but also with respect to SOGI in terms of acceptance and in terms of legalities, etc. But I think what's important for us, and when we're talking about SEAH, is we really want to focus on the project, and we really want to focus on the risks within the project context, and basically to make sure that we are not putting people more at risk of potentially being exposed to SEAH because of project interventions, and making sure that we have the mechanisms in place to handle it if that were the case. And part of this really is, irrespective of legal context, making sure that there is a survivor-centered approach. And by that we mean that any survivor of a SEAH incident first and foremost gets the necessary support that they need before even taking the complaint potentially forward. And that would mean, for example, referring the survivor to necessary support services in place, etc., and for them to have consent and consultation about what to do with the allegation. So national laws, of course, in context are specific, but taking a step back before you even get it to that level, it's about making sure that we do whatever we can in terms of prevention, and that we put the survivor's interest in place first before thinking forward. And of course, we would have to be compliant in terms of national legislation where there were specific reporting requirements, etc. But the first and foremost, it has to be about the survivor and handling the case well and putting mechanisms in place. Perhaps I will defer to Malika if she wants to elaborate a bit more in terms of our proposed good practice note on what it actually says about specifically about legislation and national laws, and if she also wants to take the SOGI related question. Malika?
Yes, thank you, Sam. Thank you, Sam. So as Sam mentioned, country frameworks are an important part for the risk assessment for every project. But if we look at the whole range of the risks, of the factors that have to be considered when we do the risk assessment, the existence country level frameworks is only part of it. We try to look more specifically on what are the changes the project might bring to the project area. We're also looking beyond the existing legal frameworks, and we have to understand how the laws been implemented in practice. And this is very important part of the country consultation process during the project preparation, where we have to consult, if the recommendation says we have to consult with the women's machinery and women's organizations to see what are the existing mechanisms to enforce laws. And if these existing mechanisms are actually effectively addressing the issues related to gender-based violence and like, you know, as a more like broader context, but also more specific to the sexual violence. In terms of how we can address the gaps, this is again distinction between two areas of work for ADB. It's the compliance versus do good or aspirational work. We do support our government in their efforts on revising laws and policies, and we're doing it through the policy dialogue, through our policy-based lending, but also through our technical assistance. Maybe one of the examples can be that we had a technical assistance project that was looking at laws and legal frameworks in place in 3 countries. And how these laws and policies and how these laws and policies and practices actually affecting women's resilience to climate change and disasters. And we were building dialogue with our counterparts, government offices, that there is a need for provisions related to sexual harassment in labor code. And as a result of this dialogue at this long technical assistance project, these provisions were included in the labor code. But it's not the end of the story, right? Like after that we have laws, now we have to ensure that this will be implemented. So this whole range of work on do good and compliance, it's a kind of parallel. And as Sam mentioned, we have to ensure that the compliance related measures that we are including in the project designs will be followed, will be enforced, and they will not replace the requirements in the legal frameworks. For example, if we find out that in one of our projects, we have incidents of SEAH, the project related actions have to be on what we need to do, where are the gaps, so what went wrong, and how we can fill these gaps. Like, do we need to strengthen the code of conduct? Do we need to ensure that the capacity building, awareness raising is done properly and regularly to ensure that both workers and communities know about the overall approach to zero tolerance to inaction on SEAH? On SOGI, it's a very important question, and this is something that we recognize clearly in our good practice note. We've been looking at stats, what general statistics shows in terms of who are the main victims of, for example, trafficking, who are the main victims of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment incidents. We do recognize that the reporting on this is so these incidents are very much underreported. Yeah, some of the data says that only 7% of survivors of gender-based violence reported through official source, and most probably for the sexual violence, the numbers will be like much lower. But what stats says right now that 92% of victims of trafficking in human are women and girls. 92% victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation purposes are women and girls. So we included the provisions at the recommendations do not exclude any groups. And we have to ensure that the grievance redress mechanisms will be specifically designed to be able to have an access, to ensure that there is an access for all groups, including marginalized groups, including SOGI. Thank you.
Thanks, Malika. Can I call now on Wendy? I think you had your hand up. Can you please address your question?
Yes.
And
hello,
tell us who
everyone.
you are. And can you start by introducing yourself, please?
Hello, I'm Wendy Lee, and I work on several ADB projects in the Pacific, mostly large infrastructure projects. And I'm currently working on 2 projects that are to do with upgrading ports. My question is really related to the enabling environment, but also how we get effective prevention of SEAH. At the moment, contractors are expected to provide HIV/AIDS awareness training, but that doesn't always explicitly say that it should be addressing SEAH as a whole and violence-related things. And their codes of conduct sometimes leave much to be desired. But my real issue and question is that the best preventative and referral services that projects can access are usually NGO service providers who are often well trained and have good confidential services and good referral pathways to the medical centres and so on. But these people are already under huge demand. They have inadequate resources for their own work, never mind anything that may be generated out of an ADB project. What concerns me is that it's all very well to say that we should be using these people to provide expertise, which they have, in dealing with the project-related SEAH, but what are ADB doing in order to make sure that these service providers are not being exploited themselves, because they have, you know, very often a real struggle to get funded and are inadequately resourced by governments.
Thank you, Wendy. We also have a comment from Mr. John Lynn. Do you want to state what your comment is, or shall I just read it out? It's up to you. We would like to hear your voice, I think. John Lynn?
Okay, yes.
Okay, yes, please.
So my comment here on community perception on ADB's funded project. Yes, I think this should be part of the communication before the commencement or the implementation of the project in the communities with the contractors and also clients before the implementation of the project in the rural community. And speaking from Vanuatu perspectives, there is lack of understanding, especially on gender issues. And I think if this comes first, then it will give some understanding to them so that they know what to cooperate on to inform the project.
Okay, we also have, before I ask Sam or Malika to comment, we also have another anonymous comment, and specifically it says that it's very important to note that gender and social inclusion requirements are integrated in all phases of the project, particularly in all the bidding documents. In this way, we can also address the concerns on gender and social inclusion and not see them as supplementary requirements, especially in infrastructure projects. And I think another anonymous comment is that among the challenges that are faced are the limited awareness and access to online training or studies about the toolkits for safeguards in gender. Before I ask Sam and Malika to respond, we have another comment from Andriani Puspita. Please go ahead.
Okay, good morning. Hello everyone, my name is Andriani Puspita. I'm from Ministry of Women's Empowerment and Child Protections as Deputy for Assistant and the Women's Protections for Workers and the Trafficking. So first of all, I would like to share some of good practices that we've been implemented in Indonesia. Maybe we can share some comments after I share it to all of you. First of all, we know that the issue is manpower, especially for women which lacks of access to the economy and employment, and there are still discrimination in the workplace, starting from work acceptance when working and finished work. Sometimes the women in the workplace also experience the sexual harassment in the workplace. So as the efforts to protect the women's right in domestic manpower, we kind of have the regulation of Ministry of Women's Empowerment and Child Protections concerning the provisions of gender responsive work tools and childcare in workplace, because nowadays women work almost in all development fields, and according to its nature, women experience menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, and breastfeeding. Therefore, women workers also need good healthcare and protections, especially related to the reproductive health, so that the next generation health is guaranteed. So as a reference for government and private agencies, in order to provide gender responsive and caring work facilities at work, we kind of try to provide a lactation room, babysitting room, healthcare facility, other supporting facility, including human resources. We kind of focuses on the protections for the reproduction's health for the women itself, because it improves women workers' productivity and also protects their rights. And then also we have also the provisions of the woman safe house, the establishment of female workers safe house models in industrial estates. So actually, we kind of having the ministry regulations to protect the women in industrial estates to come over and share if they have kind of to be victim and they are afraid to share what they are experience in the workplace. They can come to that safe house, and it's also provide a space for collaborative work in handling problems of violence experienced by women. That's all.
Okay, thank you, Andriani. Thank you for your perspective. Can I ask Sam and Malika to respond to some of the questions, some of the comments that were made earlier, especially concerning the importance of the perception of ADB projects in communities and how to ensure that through communication that perception is changed, and also relating to issues of the limited awareness and access to online training, about toolkits, and also the issue of requiring that gender and social inclusion is integrated in all phases of the project, particularly in all bidding documents. So I'll hand over to Sam and Malika to respond to some of those queries.
Thank you very much, Zainab. I think Malika and I will do a bit of a tag team again in responding. So firstly to Adriani, thank you very much for sharing the experience in Indonesia. And it was very interesting to hear about your safe house and industrial estates type approach as a sort of forum for women to be able to report their experiences of harassment or violence in the workplace. You also talked about the importance of gender responsive infrastructure within workplaces to be an enabling environment for women to go to work and be inclusive in work, and as a result also prevent risks of harassment. That isn't an aspect that we're particularly speaking about in terms of our approach to SEAH in safeguards per se, but it is part of ADB's broader approach in terms of promoting gender responsive infrastructure, and also in terms of our engagement with private sector, for example, on how to create more inclusive workplaces to enhance and facilitate women's participation. So for example, through our private sector work, we often work with our clients to develop sexual harassment policies within their own organization. And we also, in broader infrastructure investment, we often look at things such as like, toilets for women and separate spaces and those kinds of things. So that's part of our broader gender approach. But I think that some of the ideas you're talking about are very relevant and really interesting to hear about what's happening in Indonesia. On the question about addressing gender and social inclusion in the project cycle and how we take this forward with a proposed approach to SEAH. So ADB has already quite an established approach to mainstreaming gender broadly. And definitely, if we are to take forward a more concerted approach to addressing SEAH risk, it would have to take a project cycle, life cycle approach. And actually, the good practice note on SEAH that we currently have a near final draft form very much proposes a project cycle approach where you identify risks of SEAH at the outset, depending on the level of risk, then the design would be proportionate and it would be taken through procurement processes, etc. I'm sure Malika will talk about that in more detail, but definitely the procurement piece, and I think this also picks up on some of what Wendy said, in terms of making sure that SEAH related provisions are embedded in bidding documents and the like, including appropriate codes of conduct for contractors, would be is very much key to the approach to make sure that it is embedded and that there are hooks along the way. On the issue of Jonathan, on the issue of community perception and understanding, yes, that's a really valid point. This is SEAH is a relatively new topic for organizations like ADB, as well as in terms of how do we actually operationalize it. And we fully appreciate that when you get down to community level, it is also introducing new ideas and concepts. And there is also the cultural layer and context that needs to be taken into account. So part of the proposed approach to rolling it out would be investment, a lot of investment in awareness and capacity development, both for internally to ADB, but also with our partners. And we would be investing quite a lot in training, training with partner executing and implementing agencies, as well as our staff. Some of it may be online, some of it might be in person, and exploring collaboration with other multilateral development banks that are also working in the same country, so that we can leverage on this and do it jointly, also so that it's clearer for our partners and they're not dealing with different organizations, is something that we would be very much wanting to pursue as part of the approach. I know, Wendy, you talked about service providers, and that, I guess this relates to what we plan to be doing in terms of country service mapping. But maybe I will stop there and let Malika elaborate on some of these points and respond further. That's okay. Over to you, Malika.
Thank you, Sam. Maybe I'll start with the questions related to how the importance of including SEAH-related provisions in the procurement requirements. It's important from different point of view. So first of all, it's important from the perspective how MDBs actually operates. We are not, as a multilateral development bank institution, we are not part of the contractual agreements between executive and implementing agencies and contractors. So our way of influencing the requirements is through the requirements for the procurement process, provisions that will be required to be included in the bid documents, and then ensuring that the monitoring system in place that would be overseeing that all those contractual requirements are actually implemented on the project site. So the current good practice note requires several elements that needs to be included in the procurement process. We are recommending that the clear requirements will be included in the bidding documents, in the request for bids. So it has to be, it's important that bidders understand the requirements, and when they submit their bids, they will be in compliance with these requirements. They will be able to demonstrate their ability to address defined SEAH risks in the project, and how through the contract implementation, they will address this. The good practice note also provides minimum good practice standards that would help potential contractors to identify gaps that needs to be filled prior to the works. And there are some standards that are priority standards, like establishing grievance redress mechanism, for example, the approaches to grievance redress mechanism, having SEAH trained personnel in the contractors team, ensuring that they have identified potential investigators should the SEAH related complaints occur. This minimum good practice standard self-assessment tool will help contractors to develop SEAH action plan and allocate relevant budget. And this is very important part, because I will talk later about the engagement with organizations for service providers. So importance of having budget that will be allocated to implement the action plan will be also part of the assessment procedures of bidding documents. Contractors will also, bidders will also require to provide code of conduct and the plan on how they will ensure that all workers and community members are aware of the requirements of code of conduct. And they will also be required to provide a declaration on any previous contractual issues that they may have. We know like that there are other institutions, that multilateral development banks, that are quite actively working in this area. If they had any contractual issues that were related to past poor performance on sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, it doesn't mean that contractual will be declined because of the past poor performance. But what bidders needs to do is that they need to demonstrate how the issue, how the issue been addressed, and how they strengthen the systems, and how now they have the better systems in place to address the issue. So this is about how we envisage how the requirements for procurement will be incorporated in our work. This will also require very close work, as Sam mentioned, with the executive and implementing agencies. World Bank has very good experience in terms of how they're strengthening capacity of staff in executive and implementing agencies on assessing the bids, but also overseeing the implementation of projects. Project related, SEAH related requirements in the project. So the next question that I want to touch upon is a question by Wendy, because I think this is really important, that we spend quite a lot of time in discussing with our partner multilateral development bank agencies on what are the key constraints in ensuring that service providers are in place and the quality of the services that are provided for survivors are at good level. And also one of the issues that we've discussed was what will be the cost implications. So experience from the World Bank shows that while establishing grievance redress mechanism might be not that expensive per se, but filling the gaps in many countries or project specific areas, filling the gaps for service providers can be quite expensive. And this is where we're thinking that we can collaborate with the other MDBs, because when we talk about filling gaps, it's both in terms of bringing the service providers in place, but also building capacity of the service providers. So again, understanding that there are cost implications, one of the suggestions that we have in the good practice note, and this is something to be piloted to understand it like in more details, that for the high risk projects, it will be part of the project cost. The service providers will be engaged for provision of services, for reporting, for case handling, and for the referral systems. But this is a requirement, so we have like three level of recommendations. Those that are kind of advisable and it's more recommendation type, and those that are stronger encouraged. And so for the high risk project, this is strongly encouraged to engage third-party service providers to handle both grievance redress mechanism, case handling, and then the referral system. It also, based on the practical experience of implementation by the World Bank, they already have numbers that most of the cases that have been reported, especially in the high-risk projects, are coming through the third-party managed GRMs. In terms of the importance of raising awareness, access to trainings and toolkits, we are in the process of developing several types of training materials, both for Asian Development Bank staff, but also for our country stakeholders. And this will be in the form of e-learning materials. We are also working on the development of the good practice note on how to establish grievance redress mechanism, case handling, and reporting. And this will inform the content of the e-learning materials that will be recommended to be gone through the all SEAH focals in our executive and implementing agencies. We will be also looking at how we can further support, and this will be done. This is suggested to be done. So we are planning to engage sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment and gender-based violence national consultants in pilot countries, who will be also going through the very in-depth training in August, September this year. And we're thinking of how we can use the training of trainers, approach. So the national consultant will further work with our counterparts and executive and implementing agency in raising awareness and building capacity and helping in both designing projects and overseeing the implementation of the project. Thank you.
Thanks, Marika. We have several questions that have come in, but I want to give the opportunity first to Mary. I'm sorry, I don't see your full name there. Yeah. We can't hear you.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Mary Dino Tanjante from the Philippines, Department of Transportation and part of the NSERX project. So I agree a lot with the discussion, and I have a lot of things on my mind, but I would like to focus on three. First is a question, because I'm the one who actually asked for the, particularly on the absence of the law. If there's no law, can we still use the safeguard policy as our basis? So on our efforts? So actually, would it suffice, or do we still really need to have the national law to ensure that our programs or our efforts that we're doing are being pushed through? And two comments for the requirements. I think it's very important to ensure that we have specific teams, especially for the project implementers that will focus on gender equality and social inclusion. It's been in our existing in our experience, it's very helpful because we have our own gender equality and social inclusion team that's actually focused. However, on other projects that are not entirely ADB funded, they had issues and concerns because they don't have any people working related to it. So that's one concern on the requirements. And the second, I think, is more on the knowledge product and ensure how ADB, hopefully ADB can really help us as project implementers in the monitoring and evaluation techniques that we can do to ensure that gender equality, social inclusion, or the GBV-SEAH monitoring and evaluation is being monitored and evaluated well. So that's my three comments. Thank you. And one question, sorry.
Thanks, Mary. Before I go back to Sam and Malika, there were two related anonymous questions that came in, and I'd like to go over them because I think they're actually very important. One of them states, has any thought been given to incident reporting and incident investigation, and particularly in the various types of contracts and the extent to which there is accountability for this from the beginning of a contract? And also related, would ADB consider contractual controls in the design of infrastructure contracts to provide some enforceability? For example, no tolerance payment penalties for non-conformity and so on, as often these policies are toothless unless there's a specific and can be particularly dangerous when ADB has brought the risk into the community. So this is the first one. The second one, during SEAH risk assessments, especially for infrastructure development, is it possible to have a list of, it says activities, but I guess a list of factors that would trigger a high risk to insignificant levels of SEAH in a project, as this would be very helpful to the borrower and what are some of the requirements if such an instrument triggers a SEAH risk assessment. So two questions, one on one on incident reporting, and related to that, whether contracts will have any penalties associated in the case of the incidence of SEAH. And then secondly, specifically in relation to guidelines and assessment of SEAHs, what are some of the factors that would cause a project to have a high risk of SEAH? So I'll go back again to Sam first. I think very interesting questions, both of them, and very relevant.
Thank you, Zainab. Yeah, they are very relevant and interesting questions. But this is really getting to the detail of what we have in the good practice note and associated tools. So I think it's best if Malika can speak to that, because she's much closest to the documents.
Sure. Okay, Malika.
Thank you. I will start with a question on incident reporting, investigations, and the consequences. So we had very extensive discussions when we were discussing the 7 principles for the good practice note. And we've been discussing if first principle should be on zero tolerance to sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, or zero tolerance to inaction. And we ended up choosing the second one, because even if we establish very good systems and we include good provisions in the contract, and contractors continue following all the requirements, it doesn't mean that the incidents will not occur. They might, right? And this is why when we talk about the risks to SEAH in the project, we usually use lower risks, not low risks, because the project specific project specific conditionalities might lower the risk for SEAH, but it doesn't mean that it will not occur. So when we talk about the consequences in terms of the if we have, for example, like range of complaints receiving through the GRM, we have to look at the systems. For example, one of the provisions in the good practice note, we say, like, if we don't receive any complaints through the GRM, it might signal that GRM is not working. If we receive too many, then it might also show, okay, the GRM is working. We need to see what are the gaps in terms of why we have the high level of incidents, how we can close those gaps, and how we can address these issues. But we continue to support the contractor for the workers' grievance redress mechanism and community grievance redress mechanism in continuing doing this work. It's also very important to notice that when we say zero tolerance to inaction, is that I think one of the factors that we have to consider and keep in mind, that the requirements in the good practice note states that after receiving the complaint, contractor has to inform executive or implementing agency on the report received. Then, based on the information that is available, the contractor will do the assessment of risks that are associated with this specific complaint. And the risks are not only to survivor, but also to the subject of concern or potential perpetrator, reputational risks for the executive and implementing agency, contractor, and ADB. And then based on this risk assessment, the further actions need to be planned. So we need to ensure that there are mitigation measures that are included in the plan, and then the investigation will start. The objective of investigation, the main objective of investigation, is to find out if the case has actually happened, keeping in mind that when we receive the case, the first basic approach of survivor-centered principle, that we believe that case happened. Woman doesn't need to prove that this happened to her. So unless it's proven otherwise, we believe that case happened. The next question will be if this case actually related to ADB operations, because there might be incidents that are not involve ADB finance personnel. And this is where the good practice note preamble clearly states the scope of the good practice note, what we are covering. So the recommendation covers all personnel that is financed through ADB money. Like basically it's, for example, project management unit staff and sexual harassment that may happen in the project management unit. It's a contractor staff, and within the contractor staff, it can be worker to worker or worker to community. This is in terms of the incidents, reporting, and consequences. And then to close the case, we require in the good practice note that the case closure report will tell us basically 3 facts. If this was linked to the ADB financing, what type of services were provided to the survivor and what is status with survivor, and then what steps were taken against perpetrator. And when we talk about the subject of concern or perpetrator, this has to be clearly identified in the code of conduct of the contractor, and it has to be aligned with the labor code. So the next question was if we can provide list of factors that that might have an impact on the risk categorization. It's actually part of the good practice note, and we've been looking at different groups of factors. We hope that I believe that the good practice note will be approved soon, and it will be published and it will be translated to languages of those 5 countries where the good practice note will be piloted. And the same factors are actually used for the risk assessment tool, which is the e-tool that will be used during the project concept and during the project finalization of project design, because the information will be first it will be based on the information which is available at the project early stages, and then it will be further filled up during the due diligence. So we are looking at actually 5 groups of factors. We're looking at the existing country-specific factors like prevalence of gender-based violence, legal frameworks in place. We will be looking at the information that we will be receiving through the consultations with women's organizations and the women's machinery and the local communities. And then we will be looking at 3 groups of factors that are related to project-specific. We also use different weights for these factors, with the country-specific factors weighting less than the project-specific factors, because it's very important to understand that country-specific factors do not really trigger the high risk for SEAH. It's about project. For example, if we have in the same country, in the same project, we have project with a large labor influx, mostly workers who will be coming from other countries, who are not aware of the requirements, who don't speak local language, who are moving to the country without their family. So the risk will be higher than for the project with a smaller labor influx, mostly from the same region. So people who are aware of all the requirements in the national laws, but also aware of the traditional settings on how you're dealing with a local woman, local girl. When the document will be published, you will see the list of all these factors and the explanation why these are important factors to be taken into account. I think that's yeah.
Thanks, Malika. We have another comment from John Lynn. Do you want to, John Lynn, do you want to make your comment? Are you there?
Yes. So the comment I have there is, before any commencement of any ADB-funded project, it is best to ensure that there's a gender officer already in place with the IDB client to oversee and be familiar with Gov't activities and to ensure a smooth implementation of the project, especially with gender activities. And also one question coming up, how can ADP support communities that their projects are in on communities who lack support services? And speaking from experience, there are communities that ADPs have project within them, and with a geographical location and lack of communication and lack of infrastructure, it is difficult for women to have access to support services. So how can ADP come in to support all those communities? Yeah, I think that's all from me.
Thank you. Any takers on that, Samantha, Malika?
Well, I think there are two parts of that question. So maybe I can take the first part about, the importance of having a gender specialist on the project team. And so I think that applies for our broader gendered approach anyway. And I fully agree with you on the importance. I think here in this context, because we're talking about how to address really in a more intentional way SEAH risks. So it's really a newer area for us. We do need to resource it and build capacity to handle it. So at the moment, because it is not yet a policy or part of a policy, we're approaching it through a good practice note, which is advisory in nature, but we will be piloting it. So while we are piloting it in the pilot countries, we will be having dedicated national consultants assigned to those countries that can help build that capacity and help work with project teams to roll it out. But in the longer run, if this were to become policy or incorporate into the future safeguards policy statement, then yes, we would need to think about how that falls into broader resourcing across ADB staff, but also how that is handled at project level. But yes, I fully agree with you that this is something that has to be adequately resourced, and really we need to build capacity for at all levels for handling it, because it is a relatively new area and a very complex area to deal with. I would let Malika talk about the access to service issue, because she already touched on it earlier, but maybe she can elaborate a bit more. And then I don't know, maybe Bruce, you want to comment on the resourcing and staffing and expertise issue, how you see it going forward. I'll leave that to you if you'd like. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Sam. As I mentioned earlier, access to services is a very important area for our work. Maybe what I need to mention is that one part of the exercises for us is to do the service mapping and understand the presence of the service providers in the project area, and how we can refer to the service providers during the project implementation should the SEAH related cases occur. And survivor-centered approach also requires that we refer the reporter, like the woman or girl or man or boy who will step up and report the case. The first thing we do is that we refer the person to the service provider before we even start investigation if this is actually related to ADB project, because this is the key requirements of the survivor-centered approach. Like before we even we start thinking about, do we really trigger this incident, we have to ensure that survivor has access to services, starting from the medical services that has to be provided on the priority basis, and then other services like a psychological support, legal support, access to safety, and so on. And this all will be done like as a first response measure. on the question that on the support and capacity building and bringing in expertise. So as Sam mentioned, we will be supporting engagement of national consultants in our ADB resident missions to support both project teams, like staff of ADB who will be designing the project together with our executive and implementing agencies, but also the teams in the executive and implementing agencies itself. So in the good practice note, it's aligned with the project cycle, and the first entry point is when we start discussion about the project, we have to start discussion with our counterparts about the requirements related to SEAH, to ensure that they are aware from the very early stage what needs to be included and how it should be included in the project design. As with any gender work, and this is our experience on implementing gender mainstreaming work, having strong buy-in from the very early stage of the project from our counterparts is a key to success. We can really include any provisions in the project documents, but unless they are implemented effectively, these are just words on the paper. So in addition, we are right now processing the technical assistance to support pilot implementation. And this technical assistance will be looking at how we can fill gaps and raise awareness, develop knowledge products, and do the capacity building activities on the country level in these 5 selected countries. So we will be working with the executive and implementing agencies with whom we are engaged in the project development process. We will be working to establish the team within the executive and implementing agencies, teams who are trained, who understand the concept, who knows what to do, and then we can, expand these activities further. The TA will also help us to understand the lack and the scope and the gaps in terms of the service provisions on the country level and in our project regions. And then we will have to develop the effective approach on how we can address these gaps and how we can bring in the expertise to ensure that the service provisions are existing in the place and they're providing the quality services when we do that, when we develop the referral systems. And there was one question, like it's just reminding, because I see Bruce camera is on. It was, I think, very good question from the Philippines. Sorry, I cannot find the name. I wrote it, I cannot find the name. In terms of, can we use the safeguards policy provisions if there is no law? And I really wanted Bruce to answer this question because for SEAH also, this is one of the key factors that we have to keep in mind. Right now, it's not the provision in the policy. In many countries, we don't have provisions in the legal framework, and we have to understand what will be the best way for us to effectively address this issue in our operations. Thank you.
Okay, there's one last question before we sort of wrap up, and this is a question from Kwazi Babi, and the question says, is there any plan to prepare project guidelines on gender violence, sexual harassment? How long will this take to prepare these guidelines, if they will be prepared? And is there any plan for partnership with developing countries, especially within those countries with women-based organizations? So maybe just a quick response to that, and then we can move on and try to wrap up.
Yes, the good practice note. The good practice note will serve as a guidelines, and the objective of this good practice note to fill the gaps that we have right now in our policy provisions. The good practice note will provide the overall recommendations on how we can incorporate, and it's actually targeting not just ADB staff, but also our executive and implementing agency staff, and it also provides tools that can be used by contractors. It's aligned with the project cycle. We provide the whole range of tools that can be used from the project design up to the project implementation, establishment of the grievance redress mechanism, the requirements for case handling, and referral protocols. And there will be another toolkit, the good practice note on the grievance redress mechanism that is specifically targeting action that needs to be taken by executive and implementing agencies and contractors. It will also quickly discuss, on the alternative mechanisms, because when we are talking about the grievance redress mechanism, we are also talking about like 3 layers of the grievance redress mechanism and reporting mechanisms. One in the project level for communities and workers to report, which is basically handled by contractors through the contractor provisions or through the third-party service providers. There is also should be a grievance redress mechanisms on executive and implementing agency levels. For example, if there are cases that people were reporting but no actions were taken and they believe that there is a conflict of interest, then they can go on the upper level. And then there is an ultimate reporting mechanism directly to ADB. Although we always say that our preference that it should go through the country level mechanisms because of the limitations in terms of what ADB can do. Like we cannot do investigations on the country level. We are operating in the sovereign states, right? So we also need to look at if there are any conflict of interest that we need to take into account, and if there is like big case that we have to be involved and engage directly. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I misspoke. There is one last question from, and this is absolutely the last one, from Mingai Zhang. And the question is, if there is a reported case, I'm assuming a reported SEAH case is found that is not linked to an ADB finance project, does the person reporting pay for the service from the contracted service provider? I think essentially what it means, will the service provider work exclusively for ADB projects, or can they work for others? I don't know. Malika, do you want to handle that? But I'm assuming that the service provider does not work only for ADB, that the service provider will serve the community. Yeah.
Yes, the general answer, and it's again depends on the project risk level, right? If the service provider actually engaged under the contract for the high risk projects, or this is a part of the general referral mechanism. So in terms of the payment, it's another area that we want to pilot to understand what will be the best approach in doing this. So we will be happy actually really to discuss it on the country level in these pilot countries with the women's sharing and NGOs who are working in this area to see what will be the best approach to ensure that the effective response systems are in place. And at the same time, we have a transparency in terms of the costings and the cost implications, because this will be part of the loan for the executive, for our government. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Malika. Before I hand back to Azim, I just want to thank everybody for a very, very lively discussion, and I think very pertinent questions and very practical questions, actually. And can I just say that if participants still have further questions, they can send them via email to safeguardsupdate@adb.org, and we will ensure that those will be answered. So thank you once again, and I will hand back to Azim.
Thank you so much, Zainab, and completely agree with you about the animated and very informative and thought-provoking questions. Thank you, Madhu Gupta, Samantha Hung, Malika Shagazatova, Bruce Dunn, and other respondents who addressed the questions and provided insights into what we might be able to look forward to in terms of a revised policy. And also a thanks to the events management and SEP teams, but especially a warm and huge thanks to you, our participants and informants, who raised the questions, provided the insights, shared experiences, and offered constructive ways of engaging with the ADB on this issue of SEAH and GBV. I want to reiterate that the comments on the study on gender and SEAH in Asia and the Pacific that have been received from this consultation will be considered in the final study report, which in turn will inform the revision of the standard and updating of the safeguards policy statement. Please don't go yet. On your screen, we want to get your feedback on how effective and satisfied these consultations were. You will see a Zoom poll flashed on your screen now. So if you can quickly tap in a number between 1 and 5, gauging your level of satisfaction of today's consultation, we'd be very grateful to hear your views. Yeah, just go to your device or your laptop or your computer and select a number that represents your level of satisfaction today, 5 being the highest, 1 being the lowest, and of course, anything in between. How satisfied were you with today's consultation session? And we'd like to relay the poll results to you within the next minute or so, and that's a very quick poll. If you have longer, more thought-provoking comments that you'd like the ADB to consider, there are 2 opportunities for you to provide those. The first is a Menti.com poll, and on the Menti.com poll, we want to hear how we can improve the level of engagement, the feedback, and the way the ADB consults with you specifically. Even though there's only a few consultations left, we still have an opportunity to improve and address the way that the ADB engages with stakeholders like yourselves, like governments, like CSOs, NGOs, academia, as well as private sector agencies, consultants, implementing as well as executing agencies, to ensure that issues such as SEAH and GBV are addressed into some of the operational aspects of policies that projects that we heard today. So if there are specific ways that we can improve the level of engagement, we'd like to hear from you. And you have at least until tomorrow to respond to that. Copy and paste the link on the chat into your browser and you can respond to that question. And then of course we have a post-event questionnaire which assesses and asks the question, did this consultation meet your expectations? Has it addressed all of your needs? And if so, how specifically? And if not, what can be done better? But for now, I'd like to return us back to the Zoom poll. And if you haven't done so, on a scale of 1 to 5, please rate your level of satisfaction with today's consultation. And we'll just wrap that up in the next 5 to 10 seconds. Oh, here we have it. So 93% have said that they are either somewhat satisfied or highly satisfied. All of that is encouraging. The 7% of you who voted that they were neutral about the level of satisfaction with this, we'd be particularly interested in hearing from you how this particular consultation could have been improved and what can we do better in the future. And as I said, for the remaining few consultations, we will take that on board and see what we can do to improve the level of engagement and increase the level of satisfaction that you have with these consultations. Thank you all once again for your feedback and overall participation. Your comments are gratefully appreciated and will be considered in the final revision of the update of the Safeguards Policy Statement. I now bring you back to Bruce Dunn of the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department to give us a summary of what we've heard from you and walk us through the next steps and give us an indication of what happens after this consultation. Bruce, over to you, sir.
Great, thank you very much, Azim, and huge thanks to everyone that's participated in this session. It's been really interesting and useful for me, and I think for all of my colleagues at ADB, to hear your thoughts, your comments and your suggestions today. We will be making a summary of this session and then we'll be deliberating on the key recommendations to feed that back into ADB's ongoing work. As you've heard today, we are finalizing a guidance note. We're going to be piloting that, and then we're considering how to integrate the sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment risk issues into the safeguards framework. So all of your recommendations today will be feeding into those processes. Now, it's a big challenge to actually summarize a session like this. We had a lot of points raised, really important issues. Let me try to just cover off on some of the key points, but I apologize if I'm not able to address all points. Firstly, I'll start just by talking about the legal frameworks. Now, firstly, this is clear and critical that there is an enabling legal framework at the country level or local levels to be able to address sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment, and of course, more widely, gender-based violence issues in society. And as we work in our developing member countries and seek to look at these issues and address these risks in the context of our projects, of course, it's very important for us to understand those legal frameworks and how they would apply, whether they exist, how they're enforced, if there may be any challenges or gaps at the project level. Coming to actually a question that we perhaps didn't address in the consultation, I think Mary from the Department of Transport in the Philippines also raised this issue. If that legal framework is not there, of course, ADB would still be seeking to address those risks that may occur at the project level. But of course, having that enabling framework is very important, and it may be more challenging for us to implement these provisions in the absence of a strong legal framework. It's for that reason that ADB in our approach as a development institution would advocate more of a two-track approach. Firstly, on the do good side, ADB is keen to provide support to our developing member countries in terms of development of good practice policies, legal frameworks, or provide technical assistance so that that enabling framework can be put in place. In addition, we also work with our clients, so whether that's public sector or private sector clients, and we'd like to make that linkage then to the safeguards so that we can, at the country level, support these frameworks to be in place and capacity to be in place, but at a project level to make sure that we do no harm, that we have a focus that's on prevention, and as you've heard today, also taking a survivor-centered approach. Now, how do we do that? You've heard today we've talked about a proposed risk-based approach that would be focused on projects. Is there a risk of sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment in a project context? We then would use a sort of risk assessment approach, looking at a range of different factors, country and project level factors, to then identify those risks, consult with community and project stakeholders around that, and then to develop appropriate mitigation and management measures that would be proportionate to those risks. As you've heard today, focus has to be on prevention, but it is challenging, of course, to get to zero cases. These issues are prevalent in society and in countries that we work, but we need to make best efforts at prevention, and of course then support survivors should the impacts occur. Now, this needs to be placed also in a wider context of gender and social inclusion in projects. So we're not saying just to look at this issue in isolation. Of course, we need to take a wider view and understand how risks of sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment would link to wider issues and intersectionality. For example, risks for different community members may be disproportionate depending on their poverty situation, where they're located in relation to the project. It could be other factors like their sexual orientation or gender identity could put them at further risk, or ethnicity factors. So there are a range of issues that need to be considered in terms of how we may address these issues for community members. But let's also remember for workers, there are labor issues also here, and we need to avoid harassment and exploitation in the workplace. Another issue that was raised was around the need to embed provisions and requirements for addressing sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment in the procurement process, and having also contractual remedies in place. And we've spoken about things like contractor requirements, codes of conduct, the need to link these requirements into the bidding documents, etc. And of course, monitoring. And this is something that needs to be strengthened as we build capacity and as we build expertise within the executing and implementing agencies, but also in high-risk situations to have third parties involved in these processes. Another issue is the establishment of grievance redress mechanisms. Now, this is already part of the safeguards. All projects need to establish project-specific and project-appropriate grievance redress mechanisms. But as we integrate risks of SEAH, we need to have appropriate mechanisms so that community members that are affected or have identified these issues as occurring in the community or in the workplace have appropriate means to be able to raise issues in a way that would be free of any reprisals, and of course where they feel that it is safe to do so and that they are being heard. So this is going to be an important area that we will have to establish the capacity to do so. Linked to this, we've spoken about how we may be able to look at linkage to existing support services within the community or within the country. But as we've heard today also, those services, whether it's things like crisis support, shelters, medical support, advisory services, could be legal advisory services. Those, whether they're established through government systems or supported by NGOs, can be underfunded, understaffed, and under a lot of strain themselves. So ADB will be seeking to map these services, and I think as part of our sort of development assistance, see how we can support the further development of this area in the long term. But at a project level, if those services would be used, then obviously you've got to be able to establish appropriate partnerships and provide support to those organizations that may be involved. Another issue is on incident reporting. So, obviously where there are cases that has to be followed through and investigated, protocols have to be in place. And we actually need to create a culture where there is reporting, where it's not the reporting of an incident that is sort of penalized, but the inaction to be able to report and then follow up on cases. So you've heard Malika talk about that sort of approach to zero tolerance for inaction. And then lastly, just a couple of final issues to raise. Obviously, these are new requirements that we may be proposing, not new issues, but new requirements where we're seeking to address these issues more comprehensively. We need to build capacity, and we need to do that in partnership, of course, with governments, working with our executing and implementing agencies and at wider country levels. There's a lot of partnership opportunities also with civil society, women's organizations and others that operate at the local level to provide support on these issues, and also with our other multilateral development bank partners. I think this is a shared interest. You've seen the commitments that have been made by international financial institutions, and there are opportunities, therefore, for us to work together. And in both the short term and the long term, ADB will be seeking to strengthen our own expertise. So we're looking at further staffing, but in the shorter term, certainly we'll be looking through this pilot phase of having gender experts to be able to work at the project level. So there's a lot of issues. I was trying to be brief, but I was perhaps not so brief because there are many points that were raised today. And again, we greatly appreciate this. It's a lot of important issues for us to think through as we seek to establish mechanisms to address this, very important and challenging issue. Now, finally, I'll just mention some next steps. We've been consulting with you through these regional consultations. Next steps, we're actually going to be following up in initially 10 countries for further consultations on the safeguard policy update. We'll be meeting with governments at a country level, as well as with national and local civil society organizations. All of this is intended to feed into the policy development. And on that front, the development of the policy, We are working at this stage towards having a draft policy available by about September or October this year. We will make that publicly available, and then subsequently we'll have further rounds of consultation. And of course, we'll be looking forward to any feedback that you have on the policy once it's available, including in written form. If I know some of you would be very keen to provide submissions, which we would welcome. So thanks again for joining today, and we look forward to connecting with you in future events and consultations. And until then, take care and stay safe. Thank you. Bye-bye.